90% of the world's data has been produced in the last 2 years. It's transforming how we live our lives and how we run our companies, and it has a vital role to play, putting us on a path to a more sustainable future. SDSN TReNDS, a global think tank on data governance, has just released a new report on how to navigate this data revolution, called Counting on the World to Act. This video introduces many of the key themes.
Hello everyone, and welcome to the TReNDS Roundtable on Governing the Data Revolution. Today we're going to be covering a range of discussions around the data revolution, opportunities and challenges for Sustainable Development Goals. My name is Shaida Badiee. I'm the co-chair of TReNDS and also managing director of Open Data Watch. Today we have a few themes for discussion, and the first theme that we have selected is called Out with the Old and In with the New. Do we still need the traditional data methods like surveys and census? And Tom, I thought I'll come to you with your experience with the census.
The international debate has shifted over the last 18 months. If you go back 18 months, people were starting to talk about this brave new world of wide-ranging big data, satellite data, geosensing data could all be used as a substitute. In the recent year and a half, there's been a realization that the census particularly is still crucial. It provides a way of validating results from geosensing data. It provides information which cannot be provided from big data.
We still need the surveys, but countries need to be able to identify which surveys should be continued. These are what I call the core surveys, and which ones need not be done. On the new data sources like big data, citizen-generated data, what we need to work on should be quality assurance frameworks.
But I would argue that it's also about innovating additional types of data that complement it, not only because the scope of the Sustainable Development Goals has changed, but because there's limitations on what households can tell you. Household surveys do not cover issues that pertain to water quality, so there's additional information that we need, but there's still a role for these household surveys to provide denominators in understanding how many people are at risk and having some idea about where and what type of risk they're facing.
There are two potential areas for the new, as it were. I think on the one hand, as you said, to fill gaps where surveys are not the best tool, but also in terms of the actual mechanics and the logistics of carrying out a survey. Surveys are very expensive ways of conducting data collection.
I mean, I think the common theme that's been true for all of your answers, and I would agree with, is that we should really think about new data being the gap fillers.
One of the things that we've been discussing a lot is the importance of the leadership at the national statistical offices by putting them in the center of the data ecosystem for the Sustainable Development Goals, and try to see what changes need to be made to make that happen. So who within the government do you think should be responsible for identifying and adopting these data innovations?
Who shouldn't be responsible for this within government? I think that the challenge when it is focused on the national statistics offices is that often these are under-resourced, under-capacitated groups that are not well connected into the line ministries.
They are historically the custodians and guardians of official statistics. Often national legislation will set out that only the National Statistical Office can produce official statistics. And so any new proposed ecosystem of data which doesn't place the National Statistical Office at the core of it, I think is almost doomed to fail.
I think there are several advantages to having a National Statistics Office at the heart of a new national data ecosystem. I think the first is that they have the mandate to be independent of government and to be impartial in the way in which they produce official statistics. And I think in many parts of the world that's a really important point. We're seeing that in certain countries, even that fundamental point is being undermined to some degree, and I think that's a bit of a challenge and a threat.
The Statistics Office is in the center of the national data ecosystem. But now, the Chief Statistician should be more than that. He or she should be open to these new data sources, but he or she should be knowledgeable to some extent.
There are new expectations and needs, both organizationally, so how they're placed within an official government structure, but also within the data system as a whole. And I see it as a two-way relationship, what I think is, and that's where the chief data officer is quite interesting, because there are roles that the statistics office plays in terms of formal reporting out into global statistics, and that provides a level of authority and legitimacy to information that's quite critical. But there's also a role to provide down the system, so helping out specific sub-agencies with the information they need to make decisions, whether it's the planning and accountability of electoral or elections, or if it's understanding the distribution of population to understand access.
I think that dual function that you mentioned, Alex, so data for decision making and data for reporting, it brings us back again to the goal of all of this. And the players and the actors are subservient to those two goals. When it comes to data for decision making, I think that's where the line ministries really, they have the use cases, they know the decisions that need to be made, and perhaps that's the role of a chief data officer, is bridging those two worlds.
Do you think we have the fit for purpose policy and regulatory framework in place right now? What do we need to do to make that happen, if not?
On the one hand, when it comes to statistical laws in particular, there are good examples and there are bad examples. I think the best examples that I've seen certainly are ones which give statistics offices the most autonomy. Of course, there should be public oversight and public accountability, reporting back to Parliament, etc. Absolutely. But the best statistical laws are the ones which grant the most independence to statistics offices. There's something that we've not mentioned, which is the trust that official statistics can engender within the population. I think on the one hand, national statistics offices can be a very valuable source of highly trusted information and data for society, but it's a fine balance between being the provider of that data and information and being the sole provider of that data and information. And I think society has to be pluralistic and open, and on the one hand accept that there are other data providers and other data sources which exist, but at the same time engender trust and confidence in official statistics as much as possible.
The problem is that even though governments are the largest producers of data in most countries around the world, there are still many countries in which citizens don't trust the data that's being produced. And some of that stems from lack of quality assurance. To be able to have open, transparent vetting processes where you're exposing data and all its flaws to citizens and making that clear. And so I think that's one piece that has to be improved. The other is funding. We put a substantial burden on national statistics offices and line ministries to produce more and better data. But what is the funding model by which that's sustainable? Funders are often very ad hoc and sporadic in terms of how they fund data. And governments notoriously are also that way.
I think there's also a need to really consider the protection of chief statisticians and in terms of their own integrity and the integrity of official data within an ecosystem. In Mozambique, there's a planning for a general election, and there's a general election recently, and the chief statistician of Mozambique was fired because they revealed that the population of one district was several hundred thousands less than the Electoral Commission was claiming there was.
Where I have questions about whether we've done enough is around data protection and respect of privacy and things like that. And I think that there's still quite a lot of work to do to work out exactly how we should or shouldn't use different new sources of data. This is especially true in a sustainable development setting, keeping in mind that the majority of African countries, for instance, don't have any type of data protection legislation in place.
Yeah, I mean, this gets into questions I find very interesting around the politics of data. And so it's about good governance, and it's about having the right legislative framework to protect privacy, but it's also about having a willingness from a political system to accept the pros and the cons of being open and transparent. And I think it leads to a virtuous cycle. It leads to improvements in society over time, but it also can create certain challenges by opening up data that governments or specific interests have to recognize won't always be reinforcing their desired outcomes.
Well, I think it's been a really rich discussion, and I wanted to go around and give you all 1 minute to do a closing remark and maybe even think of that one thing that you want to advise any government. What would be that one idea that you say should be on the top of their priority for governing the data revolution?
I think that Well, I think that we're at a moment in history when information systems are changing rapidly. I think institutions rely on information to make good decisions, and we need more and better information, but we need to target it in ways that reinforce the decisions that are being made at multiple levels by multiple actors, public and private.
So open SDG data. Good.
Yes.
Sam, your message?
I mean, as much as we've been talking about data today, we're also talking about people that produce the data, people that monitor the data, people that use the data. And so I think it's also important to experiment a little bit, to learn from the positive deviance in a way, to find those pockets where there are effective data champions, where there are governments that are getting it right and they have a culture of data-driven decision making.
Bravo. Tom?
We still need the old. We still need those time-tested approaches to data collection. I think that the data revolution is not necessarily new. I think we've entered a new phase of it, but I think we've always needed information and data. I mean, Plato has a quote which is that, a good decision is based on knowledge and not on numbers. And I think that that still rings true. We need the contextual analysis and we need the contextual information that's around data in order to take good decisions.
Lisa?
My message would be champions. We really have to work together, but we have to have champions, data champions, in every sector of society.
My plea is that for capacity building and regenerative efforts to rebuild the statistical offices of the Global South, to make them less dependent on the Global North going forward. And I think there really is a risk of the Global South being left behind because of data collection exercises, new forms of data which are being driven by the think tanks and well-funded governments and universities of the North. I think we are at risk of a new era of recolonization of the Global South by data from the Global North.
Thank you. Well, thank you to all of the panelists. It's been truly a very rich discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cut.